tape you're about to watch is the creation of 4 members of the Houston Crisis Hotline team. I'm Tim, a volunteer with 2,000 hours on the phones. Betsy, a dedicated board member, has 1,500 phone hours. The tape evolved from workshops we've given to local organizations and to a statewide meeting of Crisis Hotline volunteers. Their enthusiastic response encouraged this effort. Over the years, we've experienced and seen in other volunteers the pain that can arise from interacting with an abusive sex caller. I remember another woman volunteer who received 6 consecutive calls from masturbators and exploded, "There's bound to be a better use of my time." Maybe. But it seems the world has far too few people willing to be there for a person in real crisis. This tape is dedicated to that woman and others like her. Thanks to Howard for the videotaping. And here's Dot, our Director of Training.
The topic for this tape is how to recognize and how to deal with the bogus sex caller. I'm assuming that most of you are interested because you are volunteers, staff, or administrators at suicide prevention lines, telephone helplines, RAP lines, crisis intervention. Most lines that publish a number are subject to use, which is what we want, subject to abuse, and subject to misuse. If you review the mission statement of your agency, you will probably find that it is all-encompassing, that hotlines, helplines are set up to help callers in crisis, to offer counseling, to offer intervention. Suddenly, a kind of caller comes along that is resistant to the kind of mission that you set out for yourself. And this is the kind of caller that we at Crisis Hotline in Houston call the bogus sex caller or the telephone masturbator. At Crisis Hotline in Houston, we use the name bogus sex caller to differentiate this telephone masturbator from other callers who are calling, for lack of a better word, for a legitimate reason, with some sexual dysfunction, concerns about their own sexuality, and need a hotline for information and the other kind of support services that can be presented and they can be helped with. But the bogus sex caller is not calling for those reasons. The bogus sex caller is generally a male who is using the telephone to connect with a female volunteer for the purpose of sexual stimulation and gratification by phone. Now that's a big difference between a legitimate caller and someone who is calling to connect with a female volunteer. Oftentimes, males are also involved. Our male volunteers do receive telephone calls from bogus sex callers, but generally it is our female volunteers, and it is our female volunteers who get upset, sometimes leave. What do we do at Crisis Hotline in Houston to help with this kind of situation? Before we move into that, I want to make a distinction also between the obscene caller. The obscene caller is the kind of person that calls me and calls you, very obvious, upfront, lewd suggestions, remarks, very easy to detect. So what you do, you hang up. The bogus sex caller differently calls with many, many varied storied themes, with more manipulative stories, and is more difficult to detect, and a volunteer goes along before determining, wow, this is not the kind of caller that is calling with some legitimate reason. As I said before, the bogus sex caller is much harder to detect than the more obvious obscene caller. The language of the bogus sex caller is veiled. Every attempt is made to lure the female volunteer into his or her own sexual stimulation. This confounds the volunteer, and it certainly confounded agencies for many, many years, particularly in the early years of operation, when there wasn't a body of knowledge, there really wasn't much information that focused on this kind of caller and how we could deal with a caller on a telephone hotline. In 1983, Patrick Carnes published his book, Out of the Shadows, How to Deal with Sexual Addiction. That was like a light bulb going off. It was helpful for us to read it and get some understanding of this kind of caller in the cycle of sexual addiction that Patrick Carnes describes. Another book that has been most helpful, in fact, it is the basis for how we have evolved in dealing with the bogus sex caller, and that's a book by Dr. Vonda Wark called The Sex Caller and the Telephone Counseling Center. She published that as the result of many years on a hotline and utilized it for her PhD thesis from Columbia. Both of those books serve us well and serve as the basis not only for this presentation, but how we work with the masturbator caller. The best way to help us move into how we do it is to listen to a role play. We're going to have a role play, and the volunteer, Betsy, will be a brand new volunteer, full of the enthusiasm and the eagerness to help. Now let's listen to the role play. Get in touch with what you hear and formulate some images or connect with even calls that you may have had that are similar to this.
Crisis Hotline, may I help you?
Is there someone there I could talk to?
Sure, I'd be glad to talk to you.
I've got an embarrassing problem. Could I talk about anything?
Sure, I'll try to help.
What do you think about swinging?
Well, the important thing is what you think. Is that what you called about?
Yes.
So, you want to tell me what's going on?
Well, my wife and I got in this swinging group.
Would you like to talk about it?
Yeah. My wife and I got in this swinging group.
Mm-hmm. Well, you sound a little concerned.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell me about that?
Yeah, my penis may be too big for the other women in the group.
So you're concerned about that? Tell me some more about your concerns.
Well, it's about 9 inches long, about 4 inches around. You think women can enjoy something like that?
Well, you know, women come in all different sizes, and so it's really just different in every situation. And I think to most women it's really not important, you know, the physical sensations. There's a lot more to sex than that. Like, you know, the closeness and the cuddling. He hung up.
The role play you've heard is just one kind of call that comes into a hotline. 4 hours on a hotline is like a smorgasbord of life. The table, instead of being set with food, is set with simmering cauldrons of feelings, bubbling pots of emotions that are ready to overflow, traumas, dysfunction, abuse, death, loss, occasionally joyous occasions, but it's a microcosm of life, and that's the kind of call that comes in. When you connect with a caller, as you well know, you experience your own feelings, your own emotions. Sometimes something in that story makes flags go up in your own head, your own vibes, your own gut reactions tell you that something is going on. That's what happens in a bogus sex caller. Many feelings are generated in the caller. From the caller to you, the telephone counselor. Some of our volunteers have said, I felt angry, used, abused, my rights were violated. Many other very emotionally charged statements. Those are the feelings that this kind of caller generates. I ask you in this kind of call, and in fact in any kind of call, to get in touch with the feelings generated. If the feeling is anger, if the feeling is helplessness, those feelings may carry over to the next call if they are not dealt with. We continually tell our volunteers, process a call with a staff member, with another volunteer, particularly the bogus sex caller, if you're left with any of the feelings that I have already described. Process it. You do not have to take the bogus sex caller into the next call because those feelings may impede the therapeutic reaction and action that you want to have with the next caller. So free yourself of those feelings, but first you must get in touch with what and how the bogus sex caller affects you. For a moment, let us look at the bogus sex caller, the chronic masturbator, as a sexually addicted person. Now, I am not talking about the one-time casual caller. I am talking about the caller that calls our agency 3, 4, sometimes even 5 times a day, also calls other open lines in the community, and this we verify when we interact with other professionals in our city. We also find that on a statewide level, callers who are calling us are calling around the state. So that's pretty addictive behavior. And sexual addiction is defined as engaging in obsessive, compulsive sexual behavior which causes severe stress and distress to the individual, becomes overriding, that is the only important thing to the sacrifice of self, work, family, friends, and any other activities in their life. The person develops a pathological relationship with sexual activities that becomes overriding, important, takes over their life, becomes unmanageable and out of control. Some of those sexual activities may include the bogus sex caller, the chronic masturbator, compulsive homosexual or heterosexual relationships, pornography, prostitution, exhibitionism, voyeurism, indecent phone calls, child molestation, sexual assault, and rape. These are the kinds of behaviors that comprise a person who is sexually addicted. We happen to get, most of the time, the bogus sex caller. Also now, let us look at the cycle of addiction as described by Patrick Carnes. Understanding and acknowledging this cycle is helpful to all of us in understanding the bogus sex caller. For sexual addicts, the cycle goes through 4 phases. The first phase is preoccupation, and that's just what it means. The person becomes fixed, their mind is fixed and preoccupied only on the sexual activity. In this case, it would be calling an open line and wanting to receive sexual stimulation and gratification from the voice of the telephone volunteer. It's a building of mood. It's a building where the person can only think of that telephone call. It's when am I going to make it? How am I going to make it? Where am I going to make it? And who am I going to connect with? So from preoccupation, which is mood and almost like a trance-like quality that develops, we move into ritualization. And the preoccupation brings to ritualization some of a fantasy that is often picked up by the caller and saying, this just doesn't make sense. That's part of the preoccupation. In ritualization, it's a series of routines, special routines that the person builds up. It is extending the mood. It is imaging. It could be imaging the phone, imaging even the phone room. We get calls, tell me where you're at. What's the phone room like? Who is the person? An image, a fantasy of a face and a body with the voice they are listening to. And that's the ritualization. And then the ritualization moves to the sexual compulsivity, which is the actual act itself. In the case of the bogus sex caller, the masturbator, it would be the beginning of masturbation or going into masturbation after the phone call is over. Oftentimes they hang up and that's a sign, or we terminate the call before that happens. So from the ritualization to sexual compulsivity, we move to despair. Let us believe that the person in despair is feeling very helpless, out of control, not feeling very good about what they've done. That's where they promise themselves, I'll never do it again, there won't be a next time. But that doesn't last very long. They go right back to the preoccupation, ritualization, compulsivity, and despair, and the cycle goes on and on until interrupted at some point, either by something disastrously happening to them in the community that brings in law enforcement, or with us in telephone counseling, we believe that the person calls when they are ritualizing their behavior. Therefore, it is most important to detect as soon as possible that this is a bogus sex caller and to interrupt by terminating the call at that point before it moves into the sexual compulsivity. Termination is the skill to be used. Termination is therapeutic and helpful to the person because at least it breaks that part of the cycle. So an understanding of Patrick Carnes' description of the addictive cycle and those 4 steps puts the caller into a perspective for us. Now Betsy is going to talk to us about what we want to hear, how to recognize the bogus sex caller. Her emphasis will be on preparing us to respond rather than to react to the caller.
How can the telephone volunteer know whether or not he or she is talking to a bogus sex caller? In her research, Vonda Wark found that bogus calls have some common characteristics, common opening lines, and common story themes. Legitimate callers may have some of these same characteristics, they may use some of these opening lines, and they may talk about some of the same things. But with a bogus call, you'll find at least 3 of these common characteristics, opening lines, or story themes. You may have noticed some of these in the role play that we just performed. For example, number 1, a bogus sex caller resists talking about his feelings. He may respond with a cursory statement agreeing with the feeling that you've just named. He doesn't want to argue with you, but he doesn't dwell on talking about the feelings and wants to go back to talking about the physical details of what happened. Listen to this example.
My mother was raped yesterday.
That must have been terribly upsetting to you.
Yes, it was. I watched it happen through the window.
Compare this to a legitimate call.
My mother was raped yesterday.
That must have been terribly upsetting to you.
Yes. I still can't believe it happened. I wish I could have done something to prevent it. I feel so helpless.
Notice how you can hear the pain in the voice of the second caller. Some callers don't show pain initially when they call. They sound like they have no emotion, but usually after the volunteer establishes rapport with the caller and the caller knows that the volunteer cares, then the caller usually loosens up and shows some emotion. Number 2, the voice of a bogus sex caller is sometimes devoid of emotion. Did you notice the very flat tone of voice that the caller used in the role play? This is one of the most common characteristics. The caller is busy thinking about his fantasy and doesn't have time to really engage with the volunteer. With a bogus sex call, there's a lot of hesitation in speaking and a great deal of caller silence. Hesitation can occur in a legitimate call too, but usually when the volunteer expresses concern for the caller, the hesitation and the silence passes. In a bogus call, the volunteer feels like she has to drag the information out of the caller. He wants to hear her say the words that he can't say. The caller may be masturbating while he's listening to the female voice. If you find yourself doing most of the talking during a call, stop and ask yourself what's going on. A bogus sex caller sometimes gives his name immediately and asks the volunteer to give hers. This clues the caller in to whether or not he's talked with her before, and it also helps him further his fantasy. When a male caller asks me for my name at the beginning of a call, I usually say, "This is Crisis Hotline, may I help you?" A bogus sex caller sometimes asks the volunteer personal questions. Sometimes he'll ask things like, "Are you married?" A legitimate caller may ask these questions too, just to get an idea of whether or not you can understand his problem. And you can usually turn this around back to the caller and say something like, "I understand that you're concerned about whether or not I can help you." But a bogus sex caller is more persistent. He wants to get a picture of the female volunteer to help him further his fantasies. He may ask such questions as, "What are you wearing? What color is your hair? What color are your eyes? What kind of a room are you sitting in?" There's a resistance towards resolution of the caller's problem. Usually the caller doesn't argue with the volunteer or even put a lot of energy into resisting her suggestions. He just keeps going back to explaining the details of what happened. The call has no forward motion, just seems to keep going in circles. The bogus sex caller often presents himself with an innocence about sex. He's obligated to explain to the volunteer the details of the sexual act. If the volunteer tries to refer him to a doctor or a book or some other resource, he insists that he has to talk to the volunteer because it would just be too embarrassing to talk to anyone else. Frequently asked questions are, "Is it okay to masturbate? What turns a girl on?" The bogus sex caller frequently asks for the volunteer's opinion about his problem. This is a very common characteristic. A lot of times he'll want to know if you've had the same problem, and if you have, what did you do about it? The bogus sex caller sometimes gives detailed sexual descriptions. When the volunteer tries to discuss the caller's feelings or tries to get the call to move forward, the caller reverts to describing the details of what happened. Listen to this example.
I came home and found my wife in bed with another man, and she was on top. She had on her black nightie.
That must have been terribly upsetting to you.
Yeah, they sure seemed to be having a good time. He was doing things to her that I never even thought of. Her nightie was pulled up all around her neck.
that the caller avoided talking about feelings and reverted to detailed descriptions. Use of formal language in describing sex acts or body parts. The bogus sex caller has usually had enough experience to know that you'll hang up on him if he uses obscene language. Therefore, he's very careful in using formal language and may even apologize to you for having to talk about such things. This helps him in his portrayal as innocent and ignorant about sexual matters. Call doesn't seem logical. When you're listening to a caller's story, ask yourself what the likelihood is that this really could have happened. What about the caller who said that he lived in an orphanage and when he was 17, 3 16-year-old girls kidnapped him and raped him? Or what about the caller who said that he raped his mother while she was asleep and that she has no memory of this? The likelihood of these stories happening is very remote. The caller hangs up abruptly before the call is completed with no discernible provocation. Most callers can manage a quick, "I've got to go now." But the bogus sex caller will often hang up in the middle of one of your sentences. Why? Perhaps it's because he's finished masturbating. It's like the caller is calling long distance. At a Texas crisis counselor's retreat, we found that many of us were hearing from the same bogus sex callers. Volunteers in Houston, Dallas, Amarillo, we were all hearing the same stories from the same people. Patrick Carnes talks about how an addiction is out of control and can take over an addict's life. This is a good example of that. Imagine the phone bills and the inordinate amount of time that this man spends. Caller uses a whispery tone of voice. When asked to speak up, the caller either ignores the request or gives you a reason why he can't. States age as 17. For some unknown reason, bogus sex callers almost always state that they're 17 years old when you ask them. But their voice sounds much more mature. Let's review the list of the common characteristics. Remember that legitimate callers may elicit some of these characteristics. May resist talking about feelings. Voice tone sometimes devoid of emotion. Hesitation in speaking and great deal of caller silence. Gives name immediately and asks for the volunteer's name. Asks personal questions about the volunteer. Resistance toward resolution of the caller's problem. Feigns sexual innocence. Frequently asks for the volunteer's opinion. Gives detailed sexual descriptions. Uses formal language in describing sex acts or body parts. Call doesn't seem logical. Caller hangs up abruptly before call is completed. Sounds like the caller is calling long distance. Whispery tone of voice. States age as 17. Bogus sex callers also seem to share some common opening lines. They are often followed by silence, which puts the volunteer in the position of having to say something to get the ball rolling. Listen.
I want to talk. Can I talk about anything?
When a caller opens with this line, it is best to say, "Let's get started and see what happens."
Is there a man there I could speak to?
Most bogus sex callers are familiar with the policies of hotlines. This line is meant to throw you off.
I've never called before. Are you understanding? Will you talk to me? I have an embarrassing problem. I'm lonely.
What kinds of problems do bogus sex callers usually call about? If you're an experienced volunteer, no doubt you'll recognize some of these common story themes. How about the dominant woman theme? This is one of the most common. This usually involves an older or stronger woman who forces him to do things that he doesn't like. He's innocent, and it's all her fault. An example of this is, my girlfriend is older than me, and she's always making me do things I don't like. Asking for sexual information or advice. We don't give legal or medical advice, but for some reason volunteers seem to get hung up on this one. For a bogus caller, look for lack of sincerity and an insistence that you give him all of the answers and the advice that he needs. When you refer him someplace else, he usually insists that you have to tell him about it. One of the most common questions is it okay to masturbate? If you get embroiled in this one, the caller will usually end up asking you if you masturbate. I generally refuse to discuss this question with the caller and insist that he go to another source for the answer for this question. Penis too large or too small? As Von der Waart says in her book, there's really very little that the volunteer can do about this. If it is a genuine problem for the caller, the best thing to do is to refer him to either a physician or a sex counselor. Sex with female members of the immediate or step family. The most common theme is a boy or man having sex either with his stepmother or his sister. This is a very common story theme. The caller expresses no remorse and usually wants to focus on details, tell you what the woman wore. Lending girlfriend or wife to another man. This takes two forms. One, he witnessed it, or his lover tells him about it. Often he wants to know what the volunteer thinks about this. Multiple sexual participants. Either the caller watches or he has sex with two or more men or women. He wants to know what the volunteer thinks about this. Again, look to see what the focus of the call is. Is he talking about his feelings, or is he dwelling on the details of what happened? Enjoying sex with young girls or boys. Again, determine whether or not the caller is expressing remorse and feelings, or is he just interested in your opinion and giving you lots of details. Transvestism. I've talked to many bogus sex callers who want to tell me about wearing women's clothes. They like to describe what they're wearing. Pink panties is a very common item of clothing. I've also talked to transvestites who just want to talk about their problem. And again, the important thing is the focus of the call. A genuine caller focuses on his feelings. A bogus sex caller wants to give you detailed descriptions. Other common themes are fetishism, voyeurism and exhibitionism, nudity, humiliation, sadomasochism, bowel and bladder control, such as enemas and bedwetting. Let's review the common story themes. Dominant woman. Asking for sexual information or advice. Penis too large or too small. Sex with female members of the immediate or step family. Lending girlfriend or wife to another man. Multiple sexual participants. Enjoying sex with young girls or boys. Transvestism. Fetishism, voyeurism and exhibitionism, nudity, humiliation, sadomasochism, bowel and bladder control. Rewind the tape to the role play to see how many clues you can pick up that would indicate that this is a bogus sex call. In this role play, you should be able to notice at least 4 common characteristics, 2 opening lines, and 2 common story themes. Now that you've learned to recognize a bogus sex caller by the common characteristics, the common opening lines, and the common story themes, I'd like to help you with ways that you can help the bogus sex caller. The best thing for you to do is to help the caller interrupt the cycle. You're going to let the caller know that you know what he's doing and that you're not willing to listen to his fantasy, but that you'd rather help him with his need to make these kinds of calls. Don't be lured into thinking that you are the one volunteer that can break through to this caller and really help him. Remember that sometimes the best thing you can do is just interrupt the cycle by hanging up. At our hotline, we have a sheet that we call the pink sheet. And on the sheet, we've listed all the common characteristics, opening lines, and common story themes. when one of our volunteers is suspicious that she might be talking to a bogus sex caller, she gets out the pink sheet and watches it and checks off to see how many of the common characteristics, common opening lines, or story themes she hears. And when she hears 3, and certainly when she hears 4 or 5 of these clues, then she's ready to caringly confront the caller. Remember that the bogus sex caller is a person with problems and somebody who deserves our empathy and our concern. Our job is not to make his problem worse. So, while you're listening at the beginning of a call and you're not sure whether or not this is a bogus sex caller, there are 3 things that you can do. The first one is that you can use minimal prompts. These are good techniques for any call. A minimal prompt is something like, yes, I'm listening. If it's a legitimate caller, it gives the person a chance to keep talking. It can be said in a caring tone of voice. It also limits the number of words that the volunteer is using and puts the responsibility for the talking on the part of the caller. Another good technique is open-ended questions or statements. An example of this would be, would you like to tell me what's going on? Can you tell me more about that? Again, this puts the burden of talking onto the caller. A third technique is silence. Many volunteers are not comfortable with this technique, and I can assure you that the bogus sex caller doesn't like it at all. But it does put the volunteer in the position of listening. Sometimes when there's a long pause, you'll hear the caller say, "Are you still there?" And I usually reply, "Yes, I'm still here," or "I'm listening." We don't advise you to ask the caller if he's masturbating. This question really resolves nothing. He can either deny it or he can say no, and he may not masturbate until the end of the call. When you've heard enough clues that you're sure you're talking to a bogus sex caller, it's time to caringly confront. Remember that a bogus sex caller, as Karn says, was often abused as a child. Maybe this can help you with some empathy and help you watch your voice tone. You want to sound as caring as possible. Remember that the caller is telling you a fantasy, and you want to let him know that he's telling a fantasy, that you're not willing to go along with it, but that you'd rather talk about his need to make these kinds of calls. I'm having trouble accepting what you're telling me. This will often be followed by the caller asking you what you mean, and I usually follow with the second confrontation. I get the feeling that you're telling me a fantasy. Many times the caller will hang up at this point, or he may deny that he's telling you a fantasy. Don't get into an argument with your caller. When you confront, you're sure, so at this point, you can hang up. Tell the caller that you're going to hang up, and then do it immediately. This is hard for some of us. We've been taught that it's rude to hang up on people, but try to remember that by hanging up, you're actually helping the caller break the addictive cycle. I'd rather talk about your need to make this kind of call. In my opinion, this is the most helpful of all the confrontations. Sometimes the caller will ask, "What do you mean?" And I tell him that I understand that he's telling me a fantasy, and that I'd like to give him a phone number of a place where he can get some help. Then I usually give the number for Sex Addicts Anonymous and hope that maybe someday he'll dial that number instead of ours. Let me give you a number of a place where you can get some help. Then I give the caller the local number for Sex Addicts Anonymous. I don't tell him what the number's for. I just ask him to write it down. Then I tell him what it is. Let me tell you about a very helpful book you could read. Then I give the caller the name of Patrick Karn's book, Out of the Shadows. And I tell him that this book will give him information about his need to make these kinds of calls. I'm not here for that purpose, so I'm going to hang up now. When you're sure that your caller is a bogus sex caller and you've confronted and he denies, this is your best alternative. With most of the confrontations that I've given you, the caller will react with indignation and anger, or will just hang up. Don't. Of what's going on with the caller, we recommend both of the books that we've mentioned earlier. Patrick Carnes' book, Out of the Shadows, which explains sexual addictions, and Vonda Wark's book, The Sex Caller and the Telephone Counseling Center. Now Tim and I will do a role play showing the correct way to handle a bogus sex call. Crisis Hotline, may I help you?
Is there someone there I could talk to?
Sure, I'd be glad to listen.
I've got an embarrassing problem. Can I talk about anything?
Let's get started and see what happens.
What do you think about swinging?
The important thing is what you think. Is that what you called about?
Yeah. Are you still there?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're awfully quiet.
I'm here to listen.
Well, my wife and I are in a swinging group.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm having a problem with it.
Sounds like you're worried.
Yeah. My penis may be too big for the other women in the group.
I'd rather talk about your need to make these kinds of calls.
What do you mean?
I understand that you're telling me a fantasy, and I'd rather talk about your need to make these kinds of calls.
Well, if that's how you feel, maybe I should talk to somebody who'd be more understanding.
I'm going to hang up now.
Damn bitch.
Did you notice the techniques the volunteer used, such as silence, minimal prompts, and caring confrontation? Compare this to a legitimate call. Crisis Hotline, may I help you?
Is there somebody there I could talk to?
Yes, I'd be glad to listen.
Well, my wife and I got into the swing group, and it's just not working out. It was my idea, but I'm real unhappy about it now.
Sounds like you're having second thoughts.
Yeah, I wish I'd never started. I don't really like any of the guys or the women either.
Doesn't sound like you're having much fun out of this.
You hit the nail on the head. But I think my wife is, and I'm not sure how to get out of this situation.
What have you thought about doing?
I don't want to talk to my wife. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that she can handle it and I can't.
So it sounds like there's a little pride involved.
You don't pull any punches, do you? I guess you're right. Sort of feels like I need to get past my pride and talk to her about my change of heart.
Did you notice how different this call was? The caller did most of the talking and was willing to talk about his feelings. He didn't go into physical details, and the call had forward motion. This was not a bogus sex call.
Do's and don'ts are generally helpful to us because they give us something tangible to hang on to. So in dealing with the bogus sex caller, one of the first do's is to caringly confront and interrupt the caller. Refer callers requesting sexual information to appropriate resources in your community. Put the responsibility for the majority of the talking on the caller. Wait for sufficient
confrontation to callers that are not. I'm lucky to have Betsy for a role model, and I hope this videotape communicates how highly we value mutual support in the sometimes difficult area of phone work. I wish you some real successes.